Welcome to Compromising Positions. I'm Leanne Potter, cyber anthropologist and head of security operations for a major retailer.
And I'm Jeff Watkins, a cybersecurity enthusiast and CTO for a major tech consultancy. Together, we're the tech podcast that asks non-cybersecurity professionals what we in the industry can do to make their lives easier.
And help make our organisations more prepared to face ever-changing human-centric cyber threats.
Today, we're joined by Matt Ballentine, an engagement manager at Equal Experts. In this episode, we do a deep dive into workplace culture and user-needs-centric cybersecurity.
He believes that the essence of modern leadership isn't just about supervision, but about becoming a nexus between people and ideas.
From the transformative shift of T-shaped managers to the pivotal role of psychological safety, we'll journey through the strategies leaders need to adopt to thrive in today's interconnected age.
This might seem like a little bit of a departure from our normal episodes, but trust me, as a cybersecurity professional, you're going to want to understand the changing world of work, play, and the art of connection. Enjoy the episode. Well, welcome to another episode of Compromising Positions. We have a fantastic guest for you today. Matt Ballentine, amazing. Matt is a sociologist who actually accidentally found himself working in the world of technology. And today he is an engagement manager for a software development business, Equal Experts, and he's held leadership roles at the BBC, Microsoft, Reuters. What haven't you done, Matt? Tell us more about it, because I know at the moment you are prepping for some big events and you've got your podcast as well. You know, do you ever have time to sleep?
Yes. I'm never happy if I don't have a few side projects going on. Ever since school, I've kind of done bits of things that aren't necessarily immediately connected. So I did a bit of an eclectic mix of A-levels, and then at university I did sociology, but with computing as my minor degree. And then through my career, I've kind of either taken sideways steps every so often. So I spent a few years working in learning and development, working for a management training company. And I spent a couple of years, the time at Microsoft, was working in a marketing role, which was an interesting experience. And I guess because I've got lots of interests, I like to try to be able to feed those and then see how those sort of feed into the work I do. So a lot of what I guess I do is connect people and ideas. And that, I guess, comes from being just a bit curious about things, I guess.
The way my mind went when you said you've been moving sort of laterally across your career was like a career crab. I was like, is that what we call it these days, or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's also the concept of the T-shaped manager, which is somebody who's got a sort of breadth of understanding across a lot of domains, but depth in one particular area. I, for quite a long number of years now, have talked about the idea of a comb-shaped manager. So somebody who has more than passing experience in a number of areas, but isn't a kind of specialist in any one particular one. And obviously, given my advancing years and my follically challenged status, there's a kind of inherent irony about talking about combs anyway. So,
So what is the day job for you? You know, what does a day in the life look like for Matt?
So my job title is engagement manager. The way I kind of most easily explain it is that we provide teams of people to deliver outcomes that are usually based around delivering software for our clients. And my job is to ensure that the teams that we have working on those jobs, including often people from our clients, because we often co-source teams, that those teams are happy and that the client is happy. And if either of those things aren't true, then I do something about it until either happiness is restored, or in some cases we work out that actually it's not a good relationship and it probably doesn't work that well. So we actually try to be able to gracefully withdraw. We don't do that often, but it's important for us, and particularly because we really buy into the idea that teams need to feel psychologically safe to be able to perform well. And in that circumstance, if you've got teams where that's not happening and you can't do anything about it, then sometimes it does mean that it's just not the right fit. But a lot of the time, it's just about being able to smooth the way. It's about being able to have conversations, act as a sounding board. Occasionally do, really exciting stuff like making sure that timesheets have been set up on the system and the next statement of work has been written and signed off. So it covers a breadth of things. And then alongside that, I'm also finding myself involved in some of the discussions about how we improve as an organisation, how we get better at doing what it is that we do. It's a nice broad role, and I'm enjoying it a year and a bit in absolutely amazingly. which is great.
That's good to hear. I was just going to sort of say then, like, it takes a lot of courage to walk away from something like that as well. Like, as in, when you're having a bad time with a client, not in my current work or anything like that, but I used to be a wedding photographer. It was a specific type of wedding photography, which was like reportage style. So nothing was staged apart from the portraits, because you kind of have to, because unless you're a model, nobody looks naturally great posing for their wedding portraits. Some did, but that was a very small minority. So I ran this business with someone else. We would talk to clients beforehand, and if they sort of indicated, they were like, right, we want it really regimented, we want these exact photos, we want this moment capturing as in this way, or anything like that, we just had to turn around and go, that's not the way we do things. And having the courage to say, I don't think this relationship is going to fit and going to work, really helps in the long run, because at first it might sting, financially it's stung, we're turning away business. But actually, if you know that you're not going to meet the needs of the client, and also you're not going to be happy, you kind of went against our creativity as well. It's really important to actually be able to draw a line under that. And one thing that struck me as well about what you were discussing was, you've got a lot of people to make happy. So how do you go about managing all those stakeholders?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's something around being able to build relationships with people that is, I think, something of a sort of tacit art. I don't know. I can stem back to things that in my childhood, my parents moved around a bit when I was young. So I moved schools quite a bit, which meant that I had to learn how to be able to become friends with people and be parts of groups. But I always found myself kind of on the edge of lots of groups rather than being in the middle of one. And actually, when I think back 40 or so years since I was doing that, I think that probably held me in pretty good stead, in that just that ability to be able to have conversations with people and to be able to make connections with people. And often, actually, one of the most powerful things I think you can do in building relationships with people is introducing them to others. And the ability to be able to say, oh, there's this person who they're talking about something very similar to what you're doing. Can I introduce you? Because I think you get a lot of value from talking to them. And that as a way of being able to act as the kind of the 3-in-1, kind of lubricating the way in which social networks exist, and being able to be somebody who people turn to say, do you know somebody who? And I don't know quite, as I say, bits of it I don't quite understand. I can get on with most people. There's a few people I can't get on with, and then you work out how you find ways to be able to find others to be able to influence there. I was actually reflecting on it today, that one of the things that I see as a kind of a judge of how well I am doing my job at any given time is, am I getting people coming to me for advice and to act as a sounding board? And I am at the moment, which means I'm probably doing okay in terms of building up trust with people. And I think the other thing, actually, from when I did work in that leadership management development role, being able to quickly learn the language of an organization or a profession is really interesting, because most businesses essentially are doing very similar things to every other, and every organization thinks that it's unique.
We're all unique, aren't we?
Yeah,
Yay.
exactly, and absolutely. And the thing that I think makes actually the biggest distinction from organisation to organisation is the language that they use to be able to describe things. And if you can pick up and start to use their language rather than your own very quickly, it builds trust, I think, really quickly. And that's just about listening and trying to be able, and asking questions as well, and being able to not assume that what you're hearing is what you think it is. I went to work for a social housing provider a few years ago, and it took me about 3 months for my brain to readjust, so that when I heard the word developer, I didn't think about somebody cutting code, and I started to think about somebody with bricks and cement. I got very confused for the first few months, though. And that's a really nice little example of just being able to pick up on their language and start to adapt yours to meet theirs. And I think it's a way of being able to get people to build trust more quickly, because they then start to realise that you are understanding what they're talking about. But as I say, a lot of it, I've got no idea how I do it.
It's an interesting analogy, I think, because because I work in consultancy as well, and have done for 25 years, and it is like moving schools a lot. And you're having to learn, but you're moving schools to different regions with different accents and different slang, and it's such a close analogy. I think I'll be stealing it from now on. Thank you very much. But even working within different teams as well. And I think back to sort of one of the purposes of this is actually the engagement with security teams and some of their language, and how building common shared understanding between these different teams. I mean, I'm sure you've got some experience with cybersecurity teams in the past, and like, what has been a challenge in that respect, and what's worked for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that being able to use your own professional language. And I think with cyber, as with many different parts of the sort of technologies field, as is with, the traditional professions like accountancy or lawyers or whatever else, using the language of your profession feels like it's a good way to be able to prove that you are who you say you are. And to an extent, there's that going on. And so you need to be able to use language that nobody else understands. But on the other hand, you're using language that nobody else understands, and therefore you're not communicating with them effectively. And there's a book written a few years ago, imaginatively called Collaboration, by a chap called Morton Hansen. And he talked about there being 4 systemic barriers to people working with one another for them to be able to collaborate. One was about people not being able to find each other. Just simply, if I don't know who it is that I could communicate and collaborate with, then how can I collaborate with them? One of them was about what he called the not invented here barrier, which is people not wanting to collaborate with others because they believe that they know what the answers are, or, and again, when you get into groups with people like cyber, to show that you want help from somebody else in how to do something might indicate that you don't know what you're doing. And therefore, that's a kind of admission of professional incompetence or something, which is an interesting challenge there. There's the hoarding barrier, which is I must not collaborate with others because knowledge is power. And that might be kind of malevolent. It might just be out of good intent. And then the really interesting one is a thing called the transfer barrier, which is the inability for people to collaborate with others because the vocabulary that they use is different. And so I call it a developer, you call it a developer, but we're talking about a completely different thing, and therefore we don't cut through. Interestingly, one of the best cyber people that I ever worked with was a guy who, I think he's now at Sage, but he was at the Cabinet Office in government.
Oh,
And the Cabinet
Sage
Office
keeps stealing all the good security people they do.
So
hint, hint, Sage. Hint, hint, Sage.
yeah, absolutely. And Ben Ung is the guy's name. And Ben was really good because he had taken on board, I don't think he came from a pure cyber background. I think he was more from a legal background. So he had a bit of an open-mindedness and wasn't caught into that. I had to demonstrate my professional integrity by being as as impossible to understand as possible, which I do see quite a lot. But what he'd also taken on board was the big mantra coming out of the government digital service at the time about how you needed to start with the idea of what were the needs of your users and then work backwards from that. And so he took a very user needs led approach to thinking about security within the Cabinet Office. And it's directly because of that approach that he took that the Cabinet Office was one of the few parts of government that went down the path of early adoption of cloud collaboration platforms, and they moved on to Google. And that didn't happen in most of the government departments, and they only kind of got dragged kicking and screaming with the Microsoft Cloud Platform some years later. But because Ben was thinking about my primary need here is to be able to deliver to the needs of the users, and cybersecurity will not happen if we're not gearing around user needs, because just saying no, you can't do it is not delivering to user needs. And so I think that those who see themselves as an enabler to allow people to be able to, in their organization, to get things done securely, and those who think that their job is to be able to provide the security of the organization and acting like a nightclub bouncer. The former get the job done, and the former are able to do it in a way that is collaborative. The latter, all of the energy that they put in to be able to protect things, which is done out of good intent, is probably being met by equal and opposite, if not greater forces to find ways around whatever it is that they're doing, because they're not taking account of the fact that people need to get their jobs done.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, the image that kind of came into my head while you were talking then was you're trying to wade upstream. The tide's kind of, the river's pushing you far back, and someone's just, do you want to go by the bridge? No, I'll just go this way. I'm just not far. I'll just keep going. Like, no, that's not the way to get things done. Come on, there's easier ways to do this. There's been processes put in place to enable people to do this. There's been discussions that have been had to enable people to do this. And I think you are right. It's about, there is 2 approaches. You can either say, we make it human-centric and therefore more people are going to adopt it. And I do think it is down to some of that knowledge hoarding mentality, that kind of the need to feel like the smartest person in the room. That does cybersecurity teams put a little bit of barrier between themselves by going, okay, right, I'm going to kind of bamboozle my audience. And therefore, hopefully not that bamboozlement will actually yield to more secure behaviors, because they'll be so shit scared of doing anything because I've kind of blinded them with things like ransomware, malware. It's going to bring the whole thing down.
There was another lesson from the GDS as well. I remember there's a point where they were struggling with GDS implementation. I was working on a GDS project at the time that effectively they'd become a little bit like a cybersecurity team, i.e. they'd turn up at the end of the project and go, you can't go live because you haven't done the thing.
Yeah.
And then I remember there was a report published where they went, actually, we need to change this and we need to think about actually building a collaborative approach that involves them from the get-go rather than them becoming a gatekeeper.
Actually, no, there's one other particular bugbear that I have about the cyber world, which is the overbearing reliance on military metaphor, which I also think is incredibly divisive. And let's be honest, whilst it is, there are important things here, the roughy-tufty world of the armed forces and the slightly nerdy world of cybersecurity are in many ways very, 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 very different. And using lots of language that is taken from a very macho culture, I don't think helps. It alienates a lot of people because there's a massive incongruence between, the language being used and the reality of the people using the language.
Absolutely. And I think it doesn't just alienate people engaging the cybersecurity team. I think it alienates people wanting to work in cybersecurity as well. So, my dad was in the army, but I wasn't. And so I don't talk that way. I definitely think that militaristic language doesn't really serve our needs. But when I think about all the time cybersecurity teams I've worked in, there is quite a lot of people that are from military backgrounds. If you've dealt with secrets and communication and things like that, it is a good career path for people. But I think the language hangover is, as you say, not useful. And I'm reminded of a study I read about the militarization of COVID, the language that we were using in COVID. So, Boris Johnson would come up and say, we've got to fight this invisible enemy and things. And people at the start were praising his rhetoric because obviously he was trying to copy William Churchill, his big hero. History has definitely said that he is not the next Winston Churchill. Getting a bit of political on this podcast, but that's my opinion. But what later on the sort of linguists were coming out with, going, actually, because we're not actually fighting a person, that use of military language actually makes people feel more defenseless. And if you think about it from a cybersecurity perspective, when we use military language, the threat is still kind of similar because you can't punch a virus in the face and I can't punch a phishing email in the face. So it makes, if I say to someone, we've got to fight this threat together, or we've got to attack this enemy together, with what tools does the average person have to do that? And it just makes people feel helpless. And when people feel helpless, apathy sets in. And when apathy sets in, you've lost people. You've lost any kind of support you can do. Nobody cares about helping you anymore. And that's disastrous for a security team. So I think you're totally right in saying that militaristic language is not serving us at all.
So you have a refreshing idea. I personally believe in this, and I really try and bring joy into work. But you have an idea that work can be fun, which is like probably sends horror down the spine of some people. Can you talk about how this journey led you to create the Play Cards series?
Yes. So since about 2015, I've been doing research into thinking about ideas of play at work. And it started with observations about the way in which my kids played with Lego and the ways in which I saw them from just throwing it at each other because they're boys and not really knowing what it was there for, but they had it, so they'd throw it at each other, through to the way in which they would get out a set of instructions and methodically follow the instructions so that they got to the model that they wanted, to the way in which I would see them have an idea for something that they would want to build, and then through a process of trial and error, they'd get to something approximating it, through to them just these kind of flights of fantasy where they would just kind of, I don't know, as a child of the 70s, the kind of Lego free play mode where they would just spend hours just doing stuff and there was no real aim to it. And what it made me realise was that felt, talking a metaphor again, but that felt like there was an interesting parallel there with the way in which organisations approached technology. And in particular, that they were trying to be able to do the find the instructions, follow the instructions, build the model type approach when they neither knew where the instructions were, what the pieces were, nor what the model might be, because it was about experimenting with new and emergent technologies. And so what was happening was first of all, the organizations were kind of adopting the wrong model for how they were trying to be able to get experimentation and innovation to happen. But as I got more and more into it, what I also started to realize was that there were a number of skills that people needed to be able to do this playing with emergent technology. And not only did they often not have those skills, but actually through work, through school even, we were being taught that these skills weren't work-like, that they were things that we shouldn't do at work, that it would be wrong to do them. I think that the most extreme example I found of this, there's a journalist called Stephen Bush who writes for the Financial Times, and I was in conversation with him at an event a few years ago. And he at the time was working for the New Statesman, and he said about how he found that sometimes he needed to read books for work, but he felt really guilty about it. And so he'd find he would sidle off out of the office and go home because he only really felt comfortable reading books at home. And the irony of this was part of his job at the time was to review books for the New Statesman. This wasn't just a bit of side research. This was actually his job. And yet he felt so discomforted with the idea of doing something that he couldn't immediately associate as being work-like that he had to leave his place of work to be able to do it. And that sort of thing is happening all over the place. And it's partly related to people having a sense of enjoyment, I think. If you're enjoying yourself, it can't possibly be work. You can't possibly be working hard enough and therefore stop it immediately. Or it could be linked to these ideas of how we're socialized to believe that certain things, like, I don't know, farting around with fonts in PowerPoint or creating spreadsheets in Excel are work, but sitting staring out the window thinking about something or reading a book. I found myself once with a VR headset sitting in the offices of a firm of lawyers, and that felt really, really uncomfortable because that felt too much like play, even though that was what I was being paid to do. And so it's partly about how there should be fun at work. This is enjoyment, I guess, is a clearer word for it. I'm not a big fan of wackiness. That kind of makes me feel slightly unpleasant.
And I think it also, and I also think it kind of pushes that spectrum over to fun for fun's sake, as in
a bit enforced jollity.
But also pissing about a bit. Whereas actual enjoyment of work, isn't that the goal in life? And doesn't that make people better employees? Doesn't that make people happier employees? And doesn't that lead to innovation of thought and creativity? It totally resonates with me because recently I had someone comment and I posted a picture of me at a conference, something work related, and I was smiling in that photo, and someone said, "Oh, she looks like she has a lot of fun in her job," but they said it in such a way to my face, so I was like, "Isn't that a bad thing? That's a good thing, isn't it?" Right? Why do I have to always be so stoic with things? It just didn't make any sense.
Absolutely. And this idea of, I mean, it does stem that people would have probably heard of the term, the Protestant work ethic. This is where my sociology background comes in a bit. But this is something that the German sociologist Weber was talking about in the 18th century. And it was about how deeply within our culture, there's an idea, particularly in Protestantism, but it's actually a broader thing than that if you want to be able to go to heaven, if you believe in such a thing, within the Protestant religions, you'll find that partly it will be driven by the idea of how you almost have suffered through work to be able to earn your place. And that, I mean, as we've become an increasingly secular society, seems a bit ridiculous, but that's something that's very, very deeply rooted within our culture. And that actually, the idea that you should be serious at work, and that the serious has been conflated with the idea of being solemn. And actually, you can be perfectly enjoying yourself and having fun and be serious about it. You don't have to be going around with a miserable face all the time. But there's a kind of, if you're doing anything other than having a miserable face, you can't possibly be working hard enough.
And I think actually being miserable is rewarded in some organizations, even still. I recall people saying to me, "You won't get a promotion unless you stay late." Yeah. And sometimes I get the kind of rhetoric, you need to be seen more in the office. Yeah. And things like that. It's that kind of, you need to be really shown to be present, and present not in your whole self way, but kind of forced way, like servitude to like the job. And what builds from that is just resentment in the end. And so
absolutely.
Need to be kind of careful with that.
One question I have about that is, how do we start to break that culture down? And how do you approach that kind of cultural shift with leadership? Because they're sometimes arguably maybe the cause of that
The
problem.
cause of it, yes. I think, my own approach is that it's about being able to role model to give permission. So a lot of what I've done when I've been in positions of direct leadership is to be able to demonstrate that I am doing this. This is therefore this is what I would expect others to do. And there's an awful lot, I think, missed about how we follow the behaviours of others. We don't follow the words of others. And particularly if there's a disconnect between what people are saying they want and what they're actually demonstrating, that can get very, very confusing for people. One of the things that I talk about within the play cards, which is a set of playing cards that enable you to be able to explore some of these skills. And one of the skills that I talk about within the play cards is disrupt yourself. That if you want people to be able to be involved in innovation and coming up with ideas, you need to demonstrate how you do that yourself as a leader. Because if you're not doing it, then nobody else will. And it's amazing how many people in positions of leadership have got a very conservative, small c conservative approach to life, and how often they haven't done anything particularly different for many years. They've just followed a set little path and they've got to where they are because they've followed the path. And then they're expecting people to be able to do things around innovation around them. I've been doing it recently. This year, I've been running an experiment called 100 Coffees, and it started with the idea, what happens if I have coffee with 100 people over the course of the next 12 months, have conversations without agenda on the basis of just wanting to see what happens. And so I've actually completed the 100 in the last few weeks, and I've learned loads through that. I've made new contacts and I've built new relationships. I've fostered relationships with people I've not known for years. I've got to know some of my colleagues much better as a result of this. But I've also been talking about it and working out loud around it to be able to show that this is a thing, and we should be talking about the fact that we are finding this time to be able to make connections with people and have conversations with people and have conversations about things that we think matter rather than what's on the agenda. And it's been amazing how, particularly for people working in larger corporates, the idea of taking an hour twice a week when you are going to not have an agenda and you don't know what might come out of it is like an act of corporate sabotage. I can't possibly in my micromanaged 30-minute units of Outlook time have some bit where I'm just going for coffee. And yet at the same time, that you've got organisations telling everybody they need to go back into the office for all this face-to-face time that they're missing out on. But for goodness sake, make sure it's all agendaed and you've got a spreadsheet out the back of it. So these weird disconnects. And I think that being able to, as leaders, be able to demonstrate the behaviours that we want to see is super, super important.
And it's, as you were sort of talking then, it just made me think how kind of dystopian our time-boxed lives have become, really. Time-boxed interactions with things. And yeah, when you did say an hour with no agenda, like I almost started feeling a cold sweat because I'm so not used to it anymore. All my interactions with everyone I work with is time-boxed. This is time-boxed and kind of pre-planned, and that spontaneity is something that's really becoming almost an aversion to the normal order. And that, to me, when I say that out loud, sounds very scary. Wow, there was a lot to unpack there, and I thought the discussion around the use of militaristic language was really interesting, and I'm sure many of our listeners will relate to it.
Yes, we really should consider being more mindful about our use of language when it comes to cybersecurity, or we'll risk turning people off.
Once people have turned off from the message, we've lost that first line of defence, so it's really important not to do that.
That's still pretty militaristic language.
Yeah, I did say defence, didn't I? Yep, I must try harder. Well, you lucky listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, there is going to be a part 2 with Matt next week because he was so great we had to bring him on twice.
We'll be talking about how we could package up security better when it comes to engagement and how we have to start getting more comfortable with discomfort.
And I think probably one of the most important questions we'll address next week and on the podcast so far is, what would Dolly Parton do? We hope you enjoyed this episode. Keep safe, keep secure, and don't forget to ask yourself, am I the compromising position here?